Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the ThoughtStretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I talk with James Moore, a former physics teacher turned writer for Veritasium and author of a book titled Explain Yourself, Master the Art of Explanation in the Age of AI. James reached out to me when he was working on this book, and we had some good chats about his thinking and mine. So it's great to have him on the podcast to continue that dialogue. James and I discussed his core principles for maximizing clarity, where he argues that the most effective pedagogy there is to show, don't tell. Among other things, we worked through his framework that focuses on structure, audience, and detail. We also discussed how to create a curiosity gap to engage learners and how to synthesize direct instruction to improve your teaching. Before we get started, don't forget to check out wegrowteachers.com, our website for our professional learning resources. And as of today, there are just 25 days left in regular registration for our PBL Grow 26 summer event, and cohort number 2 is filling up quickly. Please reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org if you have any questions or comments. Now, here's my conversation with James. My apologies for the cloudy camera view of me if you're watching on video. It's due to a hardware issue that has been updated. I am with James Moore, and we're going to talk about explaining and his take on explaining, but he's going to introduce himself. He's got a fancy new MacBook, and I've got an older MacBook here, my camera. I'm obscuring myself in the slight blurriness for those of you watching on video, and he's very sharp, which is better because he's a much better looking man than I. But James, welcome, and give a little background on who you are, what you do, and all those good things.
It's true. I help people explain complex concepts as clearly as possible. That's my sort of mission. I write for a YouTube channel called Veritasium, which has a science theme, physics theme, so producing lots of science and physics themed videos. And I also help educators, founders, entrepreneurs, people running online courses structure and present those courses in a way that's as clear as possible. So helps teach people things as much as possible in the shortest time possible.
Right. And you and I touched base, I don't know, was it, a year or two ago? Because you published a book and reached out to me about that. Kind of, if you would kind of give a little bit of color to that, and maybe if you want to mention where they might get that and all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. I've even got a copy with it just here. It's called Explain Yourself, Master the Art of Explanation in the Age of AI. And yeah, we spoke about it in the very early stages of the book. I guess the sort of journey that I went through with explanation. I used to be a classroom teacher way back when I was a physics teacher, and during COVID, as many of us were forced to, I started creating lots of online resources, and I found this sort of strange result that some kids who didn't do so well in the in-person classroom were all of a sudden doing really well in the online classroom. And that was pretty strange. And I also found that I quite enjoyed creating those online resources. And since then, I moved to a edtech company called Uplearn, which makes UK A-level resources, and I led the physics team there. And since then, I've moved on to Veritasium, which is a YouTube channel. So the difference that I have now from being in the classroom, you have a back and forth with the kids. If they don't understand something, they can ask you. Whereas now making content online, you've got to make it in a way that is understood the first time. So since moving into that environment, I've become really obsessed with explanation and how can you make things as clear as possible in just one go. So I wrote this all together in a book, which you can get it on Amazon. It's free if you're on Kindle Unlimited, I think, but otherwise you can just go on Amazon and search Explain Yourself, James Moore. But the book it's kind of split into two halves. One of the underlying premises of the book is show, don't tell. One of the best ways to explain something is, in fact, not to explain it at all. Rather than me telling you, oh, Newton's third law, that's every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? The more effective way to do that is to push you and you feel the push. I also feel a push on me back. Or put you on a skateboard, give you a basketball, you throw the basketball, and then you move backwards. Okay, what's going on there? Showing rather than telling. So wherever possible, can we show through an example? Can we show through a story? It kind of links to, I know you've had David Geary on the podcast before. It kind of links to this idea of biologically primary knowledge and biologically secondary knowledge, the idea that we're sort of hardwired by evolution to learn some skills naturally, like pattern recognition. Back in the day, hundreds of thousands of years ago, if it was, a rustle in the bush, you ran away. It might be a tiger. If there was, if the sun goes down, it gets cold. So we've evolved to be very good at recognizing patterns. So if you can present a sequence of examples that's carefully constructed to reveal a rule, like, suppose I'm talking about Newton's second law and acceleration. You feel a force in the back of your chair pushing you forward. Suppose that force is 100 newtons. Suppose you're accelerating at 1g. I double the force to 200 newtons. Now the acceleration is 2g. You can immediately see the pattern there. Whereas if I say, Newton's second law, that tells us that the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force that's applied to it. That's very abstract. So showing rather than telling. But of course, sometimes we do have to tell. And then when we do tell, I really find it helpful to think about that through three different lenses. There's the structure of an explanation. Can you start with an example? Can you start with something concrete before moving to something more abstract? Can you start with something specific before moving to something that's more general? And then the structure, that's the first lens, so the order of how you explain things. And then there's also the audience. Who are you explaining things for? Can you start in their world and then bring them into yours, rather than starting with something that's totally unfamiliar and potentially going straight over their heads? And then the final lens is detail. Less is more, right? Every piece of information that I give you, and I've probably given you quite a lot in this little monologue here, not sticking to my own rules, but every piece of detail that I give you is adding cognitive load, and we have a limited working memory for the amount of information we can absorb in one go. So can you sacrifice some technical accuracy, some detail for clarity, if you can? So structure, audience, and detail, SAD, and SAD is what it spells, which is how I feel when an explanation doesn't work.
Yeah, and education needs more acronyms, right? Well, obviously I want to unpack quite a bit of that and get into some of those details. But before we do, I'm curious. Sometimes if you listen, then you've maybe heard me do this. But what was your schooling like? What was your education like? And I'm curious, how you would characterize it, whether it's through the lenses of sort of traditional or progressive, or, inquiry or explicit instruction, or whatever that might be, or was it a mix of those kinds of things?
Yeah, I guess it was a fairly traditional education. So I went to a grammar school, a state grammar school in the UK for high school, which is like a selective school. So you take an exam when you're 11 years old, and if you do well on the exam, you can go to this school. So I was very lucky to have a very good education. It was a very good school. I loved sport at school. I also was keen on academics, and always did quite well academically. And I guess I found myself figuring a lot of things out for myself. Like often I felt like the learning actually really happened when, not in the classroom. I wasn't necessarily the most attentive in the classroom, let's say. And even at university, I went to, I didn't find lectures very helpful. I didn't find being sat in a room where someone was speaking at me very, very helpful. I did most of the learning myself. The notes were great, and went through them in my own time and reorganized my thoughts and drew things out that kind of helped me shaping my own notes and my own thoughts. But I guess I got quite good at learning things for myself, which I think then has enabled me to reflect on how I construct that knowledge and how I piece it together in my brain as a learner, which then I now use to communicate it and recreate that path for people who I'm explaining things to.
Yeah, so I think that the term for what you've described there is like autodidact, right? Somebody who can sort of self-direct. And, as you're talking, I was thinking about, as we continue to have these sort of debates, discussions, arguments, whatever you want to call them, sort of inquiry versus explicit, traditional versus progressive. One of the things I think that is a factor in there is the, I guess, maybe type of student. I don't know if type of student's the right way to characterize it, but for example, I don't know if you know Michael Strong. He's does Socratic Experience, and he's been on the podcast a couple of times, and he talks about himself being an autodidact and going to Harvard and feeling like it wasn't a very good academic experience for him. And then I can't remember where he transferred to, but it was much more discussion based. And it makes me wonder, because the sort of inquiry end of that spectrum that is featured in prominently in that discussion, that debate. One of the goals, I think, is getting students to be a bit more self-directed, as you're sort of alluding to. But it strikes me that the sort of more traditional side is less about that, right? It's and I don't think they would discount that necessarily, but that's not as high a priority. And are there different kinds of students and different kinds of learning environments where, I mean, I don't want to say learning styles, because that'll trigger a whole bunch of people. But somebody like you, and I think similar to me, where I would go to lectures and find it maybe interesting, maybe not interesting, but I was always really, really interested in learning, but not necessarily in the ways that it was being presented and pushed and that kind of thing. And that's different from a set of students who, if you want to characterize them, is more turned off by school, maybe not coming from homes that are, sort of academically, intellectually engaged and prioritizing those kinds of things, having those discussions that I would imagine you may have had at home and sort of looking for in general life. And so I'm wondering, when you think about the work that we're going to talk about, the explaining and showing, does it matter the type of student? Have you found that?
I think the one commonality is, can you make something click? Can you create an environment where something clicks? Like I guess if we take the two sides of the spectrum you talked about, we've got direct instruction or inquiry. Direct instruction, people maybe think, oh, I'm just telling you something. That's maybe a misinterpretation of how it is. Obviously, it's not exactly like that. But even when I'm telling you something, can I first create a sense of curiosity? Can I create some kind of little headache that's like, oh, what's going on there? And then can I provide a aspirin that nicely solves that problem? In the world of YouTube, we call it a curiosity gap. And can you constantly, when you're explaining, keep creating these mysteries that you then solve, that then sort of creates another mystery that then solves, which keeps that attention. And then I think, this is obviously the one of the big benefits of an inquiry kind of method, that you create that light bulb moment yourself sometimes. But I remember back when I was a classroom physics teacher, whenever I used to run experiments, it was chaos, and the kids rarely ended up at the conclusion that I was hoping that they would land at. So what I often found worked better was, if I created under quite controlled settings the experiment myself for the pattern I was hoping to show, and then all of a sudden a nice straight line appears on the board, then they're like, ooh, okay, what's the pattern here? What's going on? That sort of created that sense of inquiry and something clicking in a much more controlled setting. And then, practicals were still sort of super useful for teaching the kids investigative skills, measuring, analyzing their results, a whole load of things, but for the actual core academic concepts, I kind of isolated those two things.
Mm. So you mentioned cognitive load, and of course I've talked with Sweller and have been investigating that, and I think it's a very useful concept, but I think there's some limitations. And one of the things that you mentioned, the curiosity gap, that strikes me as a bit in tension with the sort of expertise reversal effect, right? The idea that you have novices, that inquiry and what some people might call productive struggle or unproductive struggle is not efficient. And so we should just be really explaining, we should be telling them, really building that knowledge, building that schema knowledge and domain understanding before getting into something that might be more curiosity based. I would argue that, I certainly think there's some validity to that, but I would argue, in kind of what you're saying, is that there's a real dynamic and when done well, which is a heavy qualifier, to to using some sort of inquiry, and I'm curious how you think about that tension to sort of pique that curiosity. But it also strikes me, and I've not seen research and evidence of this, maybe because there's not been research and evidence done on it. There's some things that are alluding to it, but that it strikes me as intuitively true that using inquiry to not only create curiosity, but also to sort of create a sort of schematic, conceptual framework that will help the learners to, when they're coming to that knowledge that you might be explaining and showing, they have some places to put it, because they've done a little bit of work of sort of creating a sort of mental model is one way. I don't know if that's exactly accurate. And that the curiosity very likely might help sort of ease the friction or reduce the friction of cognitive load, because while engagement is a poor proxy for learning, it also is a motivator. If learners are motivated to learn something, they're much more likely to persevere and sort of maybe push through that cognitive load. So I'm curious how you think about that tension.
Yeah, I think there are like a couple of things going on there. One is, as you say, motivation. If you have motivation, that can outperform basically anything. You can have poor instruction, you can have poor resources. If you're motivated, then you're going to persevere. So that's one thing. And curiosity is a motivator. We're sort of, I think we're hardwired to learn, right? I think learning is intrinsically satisfying. And I think there's a decent amount of evidence to show that. So like humans are kind of intrinsically curious beings, because it's beneficial to us. And I think one of the other things like that you touched on there is like a big misconception when it comes to explaining things. Because when you're an expert, we talk about expert-induced blindness. We often store things in a very small number of like frameworks or rules or laws. So if I think about myself as a former physics teacher, when I'm solving a physics problem, like how fast is a car accelerating or something like that, I think about Newton's laws. There are 3 laws that Newton came up with, and you can basically use them to solve any mechanics problem. So I always start there and I'm like, okay, I can solve this car accelerating, I can solve a rocket taking off, I can solve this thing going around a bend, all good. So whenever I used to teach that, I would say to the kids, okay, here are these 3 laws. You can use them for everything. Off you go. Go and try them on different things. Of course, that didn't work, because me as an expert, I now store information in a very efficient top-down kind of way. But when we're teaching, we don't learn that way. I didn't learn that way when I learned it. We learn through a series of examples, and then we can infer the rule. We can infer the pattern, so that then when you put a name to it, as you were saying, you've got these mental dots, some kind of schema. If I say Newton's 3 laws at you, and I've not described the patterns that I'm talking about, there's no shelf in your mind for that to fit on. There's no dots in your mind for that to connect. So as experts, we tend to think kind of top down when we apply things. But as teachers, we want to start bottom up. Lots of examples, allow them to see the pattern. I think, it's rather than thinking about teaching as transferring by, like pouring knowledge from my brain into yours, it's rather creating a scenario by which you can see what I see.
Okay, yeah. That's interesting. And I don't know if you're familiar with Christian Moore Anderson, but he's got a new book that talks about, I think, what you're getting at a little bit in terms of making meaning, right? But there's also there's 2 pieces to that, right? So it's not just transmission of knowledge, like you're saying, but like you are sharing your expertise, you are sharing your knowledge as a teacher, or as a professor, or whatever that might be, instructor. But what gets transmitted or shared or whatever, explained, shown, is one version of it. But if you're explaining that and showing it to me, my version of it isn't the same as your version, because I've got other background knowledge and I've got other things and the ways that I'm thinking about it. And in his book, he talks about first order reality and second order reality. The second order reality is the meaning that the learner is making of it. And then, how do you check for understanding? How do you check to know what that person is, how they've made meaning of it? and that he would say is, it takes some conversation. Not, many whiteboards is not going to help you get to that piece, and I think that's a limitation there. So I guess if you're thinking about the explanation and showing part, how do you account for that check for understanding?
Well, it's hard in an online environment. If you're writing videos for YouTube, you haven't really got much of a chance to check for understanding. Your check for understanding is looking at the comments and seeing if people got it or not. But I think if you're in a classroom environment or a one-on-one environment, something I used to do badly, I remember I would say, "Oh, does that make sense? Does that make sense?" And the kids are like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." Obviously, they come to do their homework. None of them can, or a small percentage of them can actually do it. So it's rather than saying, "Does that make sense?" It's, "Okay, now here's a problem using what I've just taught you. Go and work out the acceleration of this car." That's does it make sense as a poor proxy for can they actually do the thing?
Right. Yeah. Does everybody understand?
Exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
Or even better, if there was an intermediate, it would be, does anyone not understand? Because then it's a sort of psychological thing, right? Because does everybody understand? Or everyone's like, nodding around. But then if you at least say, is there any one person who does not understand? That at least if you've got someone who's confident enough to put their hand up, which if you're teaching a room of adults, you often will. That's one step better than, all make sense to. Or even, is there any one part of that? Or again, framing the question in a slightly different way, what's one part of that you were least sure about? Can someone put up their hand and tell me one part of that they found least convincing or least understandable?
Right. Yeah. And I've been thinking about this as I co-coach with a friend in soccer. My daughter plays soccer, and I help coach there. And, one of the common things that coaches will do is, everybody understand, talking about a drill, here's the drill we're going to do. Here. Everybody got it. And, as you say, and you can see that some of them are like, I don't want to really say anything. Right. And then you can flip that around and say, like, raise your hand if you have a question, which is, like you say, getting to that. But like the other day, we were explaining a drill, and it was a fairly multi-step process. We were showing them on a board, and then we're going to walk through it. And one of the questions I asked that I thought, and hopefully was helpful in clarifying them, I said, how many passes are we talking about before there's a shot on goal? Because it was 5 of them. And my hope there was that they were having to think about the process in a way that then when they went onto the field, they would be much more likely to have grasped it, and the time to set it up and talk through it would be lessened. But it is really hard whether you're in a coaching and in a classroom. And I can imagine, like, so you're creating or helping to create these YouTube videos, and I've watched at least bits and pieces of the ones you showed to me, and it's a problem with online courses, right? We have online courses that I was very hesitant to create, but eventually did. There's almost no way. There is no way for me to know if somebody's understood, right? So the onus is on the learner, and there's not a question there. I'm just kind of like really thinking through the mechanics of this, and I'm curious, like, again, how you think about any of those pieces as they relate to teaching and learning, and that sort of transmission of knowledge.
I think the example of the question that you asked was like an excellent example of a good question, right? Because you weren't asking, okay, does everyone understand the drill? You were like, okay, what is a question that shows me that they understand, rather than them telling me that they understand? Because there's a much more reliable way of measuring that. I guess when it comes to teaching and learning, I think about sort of 3 things. There's diagnosing, what do they know, what don't they know? That's often done with assessment, effective questions, some kind of diagnostic tool. Then you've got the initial instruction or the explaining, and this is where understanding happens. If I explain something well, you can understand it. there's a difference between understanding and actually applying, being able to solve the problem. You can feel like it's clicked, but feeling like it's clicked isn't the same as actually being able to replicate it. And then there's remembering, retaining that information. And this is where people talk about the forgetting curve and retrieval practice, and that kind of thing is important. And then at some point down the line, again, you need to assess. Again, if you're in an online course environment or any kind of teaching environment, you need to assess, do they still remember what we taught them in the first place, or what are the gaps now? And this is where I think the future of education could be going, is these really effective adaptive platforms that identify what I know and what I don't know, route me to something that teaches me what I need to know, and then routes me to the next thing and the next thing with really effectively designed questions. And they're actually, like, there are maybe ways there where if you have something that's really effective at routing me to the right piece of content, even if that piece of content isn't necessarily as good as it might be, the routing might just be so effective that I can progress really quickly.
So let's unpack the lessons of SAD. Because as you said, you gave a lot of information there and weren't following your own principles. So let's make it a little bit more granular. So what's the S stand for?
Structure.
Okay. So unpack that a little bit more granularly, if you would.
Yeah. So it relates to the bottom up versus top down kind of idea I talked about a minute ago. But the temptation is to, when we explain something, start with the big idea. These are Newton's laws. These are the laws of supply and demand. But if you don't have a context to attach it to, it kind of just floats in and out the audience's mind. And it's not that interesting. Whereas if I go, okay, I'm trying to sell some tickets to a sold out concert. Sorry, I'm trying to buy some tickets to a sold out concert. The price is really high. But then there's this other concert where, it's a much less popular artist. Maybe the first one is Taylor Swift. The second one is, I don't know, Busted, or somebody who's maybe they're a bit old and not as popular anymore. So what's going on there? Well, we can think about the first one. It's the same stadium. They've got a fixed amount of supply of tickets, but it's the number of people who want them that's changed. So the demand has changed. So that's what's driving the price. So actually we can come up with these general laws of supply and demand. So it's about, when I say structure, it's starting with that specific concrete example that creates an image with the learner's mind first, then moving to the more abstract general rule. Because if I say, the laws of supply and demand are such and such, that's abstract. There's no image in your mind there. If I say Newton's second law is that acceleration is directly proportional to force, these are all abstract nouns, abstract words. There's no image there. But if I talk about a car with a force from the engine getting faster and faster, there's an image. So that's structure. And then also tied closely to structure is this idea of a headache and an aspirin. Create some kind of intrigue. Why is it interesting? Hook the attention, and then provide some kind of satisfying resolution to that. So can you start with something specific? Ideally, it's an example or a story or an image of some sort that creates that curiosity gap, and then also presents the opportunity to reveal the pattern, and then you can put a name to it after.
So it sounds like creating context in some way, right? Which I think is I would think of as sort of an inquiry move. I don't know if you think of it as an inquiry move. And I think project-based learning, when done the way that I think about it, is one way to do that, maybe on a bit more of a macro scale. It doesn't have to be, but is how is structure different from schema? And maybe it's not. I'm curious. I would think some of the science of learning people might be saying you're giving or providing some background knowledge or schema. No?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm providing those little dots in your neural network to then connect with some overarching rule. I'm providing some, if Daniel Willingham's written about inflexible and flexible knowledge, I'm providing some inflexible knowledge, which then maybe once you've got enough of it, you can connect and it becomes more flexible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the A is it attention or
audience?
Audience. Okay,
audience.
So tell more about that.
Yeah. So again, it links closely to structure, and it links to what does your audience already know? What don't they know? A classic expert move is to fire away too much jargon, is to start in your world as the expert and then try and convince the audience to join you. But actually, a much more effective way of doing that is to start in their world. Pick something, a specific scenario that's relatable to them. That's what I was trying to do with the concert. If I was teaching a bunch of school children, I'm picking something that's relating relating to them. And I think so yeah, start with something familiar before moving to something that's unfamiliar, and then something that's closely related as well, which brings me onto the third lens, which I guess you'll ask me about in a moment, is this idea of clarity and accuracy. I used to, as a physics teacher, be so protective over the accuracy of my subject. When I was teaching something like, how the atom moves, how electrons move around an atom, I'd get all complicated models like probability clouds and all of this kind of stuff. Very, very trying to be as technically accurate as possible, but I lost the clarity completely. If I'm talking about quantum physics, I'm not going to start talking about probabilities and wave functions. I'm going to say, think of a staircase. A staircase has steps. You can stand on one step or the next. That's exactly how energy works in quantum physics. I'd start with an example that's familiar to my audience.
So the precision of the knowledge that you're trying to impart, I mean, would you say deprioritizing it? Or I don't think you're saying that, because as you're talking about that, it made me, I was looking at something that somebody had written about the next generation science standards, and one of the concerns about that in the piece that I was reading was that at least their perception of next generation science standards was that you're allowing kids and pushing kids to sort of inquire and think about how they might come up with a model to solve this kind of thing. In that process, giving them lots of very likely, or the person who wrote this piece might come up with wrong information, might come to wrong conclusions, and then have those conclusions and that knowledge wrong for a long enough period of time that it would be problematic down the road. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but I thought, well, that was an interesting take. Does that resonate at all with what you were just describing?
Yeah, totally. I think there's a quote from a statistician called George Box, which is, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think it's about choosing the model that's most fit for your purpose. And you've got to be super careful. This is something that's big in science teaching for sure. Especially chemistry, you're constantly refining these models. You start off with a basic model of the atom, for example, kind of like planets orbiting the sun, and then you move to something a bit more complicated, like probabilities and clouds. And you're constantly refining your model for what's fit for purpose. Yeah, the more complicated model, maybe they're not necessary for solving a more simple problem. And the danger is, if you jump straight to the more complicated model, it will go straight over your audience's head. So there's this balance between presenting something that's not incorrect and not misleading and not going to cause problems in the future, versus providing something that's accessible. Because if you jump straight to the most accurate version of the model, you're going to lose someone. And then, well, what was the point? It's better to at least start with something that's a bit more clear, and then you have them to refine the information a little bit later. But yeah, it's definitely a balance.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading the piece and I thought, okay, I understand the concern about students coming to making wrong, having misconceptions that then might linger and endure, and I guess be hard to correct. I'm not sure, again, that I agree with that, but having that balance of how do you balance the meaning making that learners are doing in any given process, whether it's on a video where you're not able to check and check for understanding, or in a classroom where you ostensibly are. And is there any value to actually having some fuzziness and some blurriness, and maybe having students having some misconceptions that later they go, that kind of thing. And I can imagine the people who are really very focused on building knowledge and having those outcomes and being very highly prioritized would be very uncomfortable. They want students to have that knowledge and have it correct, and understanding correct as soon as possible, which makes sense. But is there any value to not, I guess, deprioritizing that a bit?
Yeah, I think start clear. Start with a simple model that everyone can understand, and then show that it is a model. Test its boundaries. And a great example of this in physics would be electricity. Kids don't have any mental model for electrons flowing around wires and current and all this stuff. So you could think about, water flowing down a pipe. That's kind of like current moving down. You could think of the resistance being like the friction with the walls of the pipe. You could think about the voltage being the pressure difference that's pushing the pipe along. If you're going to use an analogy like that, you're tapping into something that the student already is familiar with. But once you've given them a bit of a mental model, you need to make clear that it is a model. You need to be like, hey, this is a model. There are some problems with it. It doesn't work perfectly. So you're kind of foregrounding the fact that, when we solve some different problems, we might need to use a different model. And I think actually that's a really useful skill that you can kind of teach the kids by, kind of side effect of doing this is that actually, I guess my background is science, but maybe it applies more widely as well, that we're always looking at models and no model is perfect.
Yeah. So the audience, I think you're asking the sort of teacher, the expert, to consider who their audience is, what they're bringing to the table, what they might know, what they might not know. And just as a sort of side note, I'm like that. This is something that we feature in our project-based learning work is we want work to be done for an authentic audience. There's some different ways that can look, but one of the reasons is because it can shift some of the quality control conversations of how do we know if our work is good from points and scores and grades to something like, does it meet the needs of the audience, which means that you have to know who's my audience, what are their needs, how do I meet their needs, how well have I met their needs. And I think that's a really important driver of critical thinking and that process. So when you're thinking in terms of explaining and showing and understanding, what's the process of knowing to the best of your ability what or who that audience is, and what they bring to the table, and their features and characteristics and limitations?
I guess it depends a lot on the environment. If you're in a classroom, you can test the kids. You can ask them questions about the subject, not do you understand X? It's, solve this problem or answer this question. And then you can build up a map of what they understand and what they don't. So you can diagnose it. And there are loads of great online diagnostic tools like that as well. If it's like an online course as well, then you're relying more on knowledge of your market, of your industry, speaking with people about what do they want, what don't they want, and asking those questions in a way that it's not like the does everyone understand kind of question, that it's something a little bit more targeted that's more likely to give an accurate and honest answer. And again, if you're in a YouTube setting, it's very, very difficult as well. You get a feel for who your audience is from people who interact with your videos, from comments they leave, but you also, I suppose, have a vision for who you want your audience to be and who you're speaking to. And I think this is that I've read a bunch of books about how to write well, and one of them is called On Writing Well by William Zinsser, which I really enjoyed. And one of his big pieces of advice on writing there was to write for yourself. If you would find it interesting, then the chances are some other people will find it interesting, and your passion and your sort of own internal curiosity will help there. And if you're not writing for yourself, maybe you can picture one individual, but like, who is your target market, if you like? Who is the person that you're writing for? And if you have a really clear image of someone that you're trying to produce something for, then the chances it's more likely to speak to a bunch of people rather than trying to speak to everyone, and then you actually end up speaking to no one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it strikes me again, as you've talked about and you shared the YouTube video, or a YouTube video that you've worked on. So you're sort of guessing in some ways. You've got some information, some market research, and you've got what you hope is your target audience. And it brings up I think one of the things that makes for a great teacher, that moves somebody from maybe being a good teacher to a great teacher, one of the things is the sort of art or skill of perception, right? How do you accurately perceive the reality of what's going on in your audience's heads, right? Some of that you're doing formative assessment, you're checking, but even then you still have to sort of process that accurately. And with the videos, you're sort of guessing at that in some ways that hopefully hits the mark. But there's also probably a bit of the sort of reverse dynamic where the video, if it, assuming it's, valuable information and there's enough people who are interested, the audience will find it, right? Because it sort of level sets. It's like I watched some of that video and I didn't have enough context. And I was thinking, what in the heck is going on here, right? Like I didn't have enough, structure, as you might say it, right? So I'm not likely to look at that video for a whole lot of information because it's not what I'm after. But the audience sort of finds its way there. But is that I would think not, but is there a dynamic like that? I'm wondering in a classroom, and I mean, this may not be making any sense. I don't know if what I'm describing makes sense. Of like you mentioned writing and you write for yourself, and I think music and writing music and performing music is probably somewhat similar, right? If the more that you're trying to create music, and I used to be a musician and wrote songs and played in a band and published music. I think one of those takeaways is that if I wrote for myself a bit more, I think I would maybe have been a bit more successful. Certainly some limitations in my abilities and gifts and stuff like that. But that when you're trying to please that audience, that maybe it's a bit less appealing to that audience. It's sort of a weird paradox, right? And now I feel like I'm just completely rambling and off the hook here. So I'll let you respond, or we can move to the D.
No, I think it makes me think. Like, I definitely. You talk about a sort of self-selecting audience on YouTube. If you go to the channel that I write for, but you're you're kind of interested in science. There's a description of what the channel's about, and it's it's about science and like quite sometimes quite technical science stuff. And I remember teaching physics. If I was teaching the older ones, like 17, 18-year-olds in high school, that's also self-selecting. I'm like, okay, probably by this point, if you've chosen to keep doing physics for this long, because you can drop physics at the age of 16 or sometimes even earlier in the UK, I'm like, okay, you guys are probably interested, so that's going to affect how I teach stuff. When you're teaching the younger kids, like 12 or something like that, then they have to do your subject. It's a much harder job. If you've got 30 kids, some of whom physics is their most favorite, is the thing they're most interested in the world, and some of them are just like, wow, I really don't want to be here. It's a much harder job. I definitely found it much harder. It was a much easier job teaching the really smart, motivated 18-year-olds than it was teaching a wide range of 12-year-olds. And I'm sure, any teacher can relate to that one.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the D?
The D is detail.
Detail. All right. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, but I suppose this is the simplest one. Less is more. Less is more. And I suppose there are two aspects to that. One is when you're explaining something, ruthlessly prune every word of that explanation and every item of information in that. Try and include as little as possible, check for understanding and move on. And then the other side of that, which is maybe the less obvious side, I'm sure lots of people have heard that less is more kind of advice before. But the other side is extracting the details where they're not necessarily obvious. Chris Bolton calls this atomization. So breaking down a complex concept into, okay, what are the main ideas here? And within those ideas, what is each and every single atom that makes up that piece of knowledge? So sometimes if I'm talking about, let's say, photosynthesis, I might say, photosynthesis is a chemical reaction that plants use to create food. And, you might think that's quite a simple thing, but a chemical reaction here, can you actually break that down a little bit more? There are some more atoms within a chemical reaction. What is a chemical? You're assuming your audience knows what that is. So yeah, detail means less is more, trying to include less information, but also extracting details and not presenting things that are chunked in your mind that aren't necessarily chunked in your audiences.
Yeah, I guess they call that the curse of knowledge, right? The idea that you're an expert in your brain, you have it chunked, and in their brains they haven't got there. So is there anything interesting to say about the desirable difficulties concept in terms of less is more and in detail? And also, like I'm thinking of like Zach Rochelle and just tell them and just really making things very, very explicitly clear. And I think he's putting that in opposition to, letting kids figure everything out, which is not what you're saying. But it strikes me that there's maybe a bit of tension there in terms of, maybe some desirable difficulties, no?
Yeah, and I think you don't want to present an explanation where it's just all totally obvious. It's at least got to be kind of interesting. Why is it interesting? Because you've had to think a little bit about it, and you're like, okay, there's a little bit of that experience of something clicking. You're like, oh, maybe I didn't think about it in that way before. Maybe it's kind of familiar, but just articulated in a different way. So yeah, whether it's desirable difficulty or whether it's just creating that experience of bringing together a few different ideas that illuminates another one, it can't be trivial information that you're just presenting, because otherwise, like, I know this already, I'm going to lose interest. So as you say, you need some kind of desirable difficulty there, something that's sort of just like pulling you along, like a carrot that's just in front of the donkey's nose that's pulling them along because they're like, oh, there's going to be something interesting at the end of the rainbow here.
So would you characterize this in any meaningful way as sort of an inquiry approach? Because it strikes me as at least close to some of the things that I advocate for. And again, I think that it's a false binary to say, explicit instruction or inquiry. I think that there should be a leveraging of sort of both, which I think is kind of what you're talking about here, no?
Yeah, exactly. And I think when done well, direct instruction actually uses that light bulb moment of inquiry, but just in a very controlled setting. So, a very, very simple example would be teaching a kid what is a square. You could start with, kind of lopsided shape, which is like a bit of an angle, and the vertical side's like this. This is not a square. But then you could straighten it slightly. This is a square. Then just change one of the slides. This is not a square. This is not a square. This is a square. So you're creating a very, very controlled sequence, which is making the kid attend to the pattern. And that is, I guess, in some aspects, creating a sense of inquiry, or like, what is going on here? Can I spot the pattern? Before then saying, oh, a square is a four-sided shape where all the sides are straight and there are two that are parallel, four right angles, that kind of thing. Like, or if you start with a square is a four-sided shape with straight lines and right angles and stuff, that's going to go over, depending on who you're teaching, that's going to go over the kid's head. Whereas if you start with the pattern, create that sense of intrigue, that inquiry, allow them to infer the pattern before then putting a name to it. It's kind of using inquiry, but without the cost of letting the kids figuring out for themselves, which sometimes can be quite costly because it just takes a lot of time.
Right. And I describe it in a few different ways of like, so you as a teacher want to be clear about the cognitive path you want students to travel, and you want to make sure that they're staying on that cognitive path and moving them along at a brisk, rapid pace, right? Where we're not just, trying to figure this out, trying to figure that out, because that's the efficiency issue. And I sometimes characterize it as push and pull teaching. And push teaching is giving that information and pushing that information out, which is not necessarily bad and not something that we should never do. But that sort of pull teaching, that dynamic that I think what you're describing fits with this is like, how are we pulling? We're pulling the thinking out of students so that we can work with it and understand and then give them more explanation, give them more detail, give them more structure, all of those kinds of things. But you're also pulling, that's sort of that leveraging of the curiosity, right? Like using the sort of intellectual seduction, if you will, of like, how do you get them to continue to think and want to think? And this is where I think the science of learning, which is valuable, I wish that there was more talk about the science of thinking as well, because if memory is the residue of thinking, then we want to get them to think, and think in the ways that we want them to think and about the things that we want them to think. And so this is, I think, the sort of complement of something that's sort of science of learning, cognitive science, explicit instruction with, there's intentional inquiry, but this is sort of an intuitive inquiry move of, in that moment, how do you know as a teacher, and this gets back to, I think, the perception as part of it, of like, how do I know what will pull that student to the place of thinking that I want them to be in? Is it a bit more information? Is it a question? Is it a pause? Is it a contextual example that you say, I'm going to show you, it's the stairs, it's the whatever it might be. And so to me, it really, that's the advocacy point. That's the sort of sweet spot. But how do we help teachers develop that skill? That's a question that I think about a lot, and that's a lot of the work. Is it just takes so much practice. And what happens when we have teachers who don't have that skill, and they're trying to pull students along here, learners along here, unsuccessfully, and then we have problems, right?
Yeah, and as you say, it's very hard. It's very hard. You can learn by watching people who are very good at it. There are lots of teachers, lots of people online who are like very, very good at these like hooky explanations, these hooky lessons where they just keep dragging you on. It would be like a cliffhanger if you ended the lesson at one point. And I think, I guess some of the stuff we were speaking about earlier, like starting with something really specific, a story. Everyone, if you say, I remember this time when, or okay, let me just tell you a story, our brains immediately light up. That's going to create some kind of intrigue. We're just hardwired to be interested by stories. So that's one easy tip. And another tip along those lines is using simple structuring techniques like and, but, therefore. This is like one that gets used in films quite a lot, or YouTube, where if I tell you, so for example, in World War II, the Germans were communicating with some really complex codes, and it was really difficult for the Allies to get hold of it. And they had to do a lot of work to recruit people, to get experts on board, and eventually they managed to make a breakthrough that eventually won them the war. That's like kind of a boring long list. But if I rephrase that as, in World War II, the Allies were faced with a problem. The Germans were communicating in a code that they couldn't decipher, and they were sending crucial messages. The Allies were losing the war. They had no one to call on to solve this. They'd never seen this kind of machine before. So they turned to the greatest minds. They sent out crossword puzzles. They got chess champions to come in. There, all of a sudden, there's an and, there's a but, I said so instead of therefore, but it's creating some kind of punctuation to the story. The and is building up a little bit of tension, building up some information. The but's creating a little bit of tension, and then the so is subtly resolving it. And then can you move forward again with another and but so, or and but therefore, to keep the intrigue, the tension resolution, mystery solution.
Yeah. I'm just thinking as you're talking, I wonder if there would it make sense to use that sort of structure in an overall lesson or a unit, because it might be that you use that in as sort of an intro or a lead into a unit, but is it sort of repeatable? Is it something that as a form you can continue to do and set up a lesson or a unit, an extended lesson or a unit in a way that would do that? Have you seen examples of that, or no?
No, this is more something that I've seen in like films, in YouTube videos, and you can do it at quite a granular level, like the sort of the example that I gave just there about, there were these codes in the war, but they were incredibly difficult to solve, so they got these experts on board. But then you can do it at a more macro level, like telling the, a sort of, there's an and at about 5 minutes in, and then there's a but at about 10 minutes in, and then there's a resolution at about 15 minutes in. And you can do that a couple of times throughout the whole video, like as chapters, as well as inside individual explanations within the video.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'll have to think more about that and and pontificate. One thing that I wrote down as you were talking earlier, and it made me think about it when you were talking about the videos and film and that kind of thing, and I mentioned learning styles, and that certainly is a triggering kind of thing. But there are different ways in which people like to take in like explanations and things, right? Like if I'm trying to figure out how to I've got a golf cart with batteries, and I'm trying to figure out why my golf cart batteries are not charging, or one of the accessories, the charging accessories has, how do I install it? For example, reading a list of installation instructions is not as useful for me as watching a video of somebody actually doing it. So that's not learning styles, but it's in that sort of realm. As you think about showing and understanding, are there any sort of applications in that sort of realm? Again, we don't want to trigger anybody with learning styles here. That you employ or use, especially maybe in some of the videos.
Well, I think the example you gave there, I think more often than not, the content dictates how it should be taught rather than the learner. So in that case, I think a video would be better for anyone. I don't think there's anyone really who would find a list of written instructions useful, in the same way that if I'm going to teach someone, who claims to be an auditory learner, geography, I'm probably going to give them a map. I'm not going to give them a podcast because they still need to visualize things. So I think most of the time, the content that you're teaching has certain ways that it's probably going to be better for people to understand it. If I'm teaching you a language, we need to speak it. This is why I've been doing Duolingo for years, but I'm still nowhere near fluent in Italian. I can say like a couple of words because I don't practice actually speaking and actually listening. So you need to practice the skills in the context that you're actually going to use them. So yeah, I think there are preferences. So this is then when it ties back into motivation. You need to give people information in a way that they want to consume it, but then you need to balance that with, I guess, the risks of believing, I only learn through podcasts. That's a limiting belief. There are going to be much other helpful mediums to learn certain things, whether it's learning a language, learning geography, learning how to change the batteries on your golf cart, learning how to hit a hybrid out of the rough.
Yeah. Especially on that last one. So I think you're right. The content probably should drive the sort of modality a bit more, although and you didn't say absolutely. I'm thinking of like my mom, who I would imagine, and I might be wrong on this, but I would imagine a written set of instructions might be more helpful for her than a video. And again, I might be wrong on that. It then makes me think about cognitive load. And one of the things about videos is, at least for me, is we can stop them, pause them, and continue. How do you, in your explaining videos, which are not really, they're not explaining videos, they're videos that have some explanation in it, right? I mean, you're not doing tutorial videos.
Edutainment rather than just education, you could say.
Right. But there's got, like, how do you think about or take into consideration the elements of cognitive load of, if you've got a 7-minute video, are you moving too quickly or maybe too slowly? But cognitive load would be too quickly of like, whoa, I got to process this before you move on to the next kind of thing. So how do you take that into account?
Well, that's difficult because you've got two competing effects there. You've got, keeping people's attention. And these days with TikTok and everything, people like new information, bang, 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 even if you haven't necessarily completely grasped it. So you're like keeping people's attention versus, okay, are people actually getting it? And I think that's where the purpose of what you're doing matters. If the purpose of what you're doing, if you want, okay, when someone's watched this, I want to guarantee they've 100% understood something, then I'm probably going to present it in a slightly different way to, I want someone to be entertained by this. And I think there's a balance there. And, if you really want to know if someone's understood the thing, you also need to test them.
Yeah. I guess maybe the only other question that comes to mind at this point is the differences between more complex learning and more schema knowledge. And this is, I don't know if you've seen the work of Slava Kalyuga, rethinking and sort of redefining some of the boundaries of cognitive load theory. He's making the argument that resonates with me, and it confirms my priors a little bit. So, full transparency there is that cognitive load theory and the expertise reversal effect is much more relevant to sort of schema building, more simple, like building those foundational knowledge pieces, whereas he's making the argument of complex learning, which is interconnected kinds of things, and that expertise reversal effect isn't as much of a pronounced dynamic, which I would assume extend to explaining and showing, right? Like, how do we, if it's a very complex kind of set of concepts, let's say here in the States of federalism and checks and balances, and all of the things, the levels of government, the branches of government, and the history of how that's played out and why it's important, all of those kinds of things, that's not simple. And so I would put that into something more of a complex learning, where, how do you think about the complexity of the content that you're trying to explain or show, and the level and the depth of it?
I think you can think about what is well-defined and what isn't. If there are things that are well-defined, then you can atomize them in the way that I was talking about earlier. You can extract all the details, put them in a cognitive sequence that is, A leads to B and therefore C, and construct that in a way that it's going to follow and naturally. If there are some more fuzzy areas, then I think acknowledging that they're fuzzy and treating them as such is the way to go. You can, if you're in a classroom, enable a discussion, enable some further research, prompts, that higher order thinking. And I think, going back to what you were talking right at the start, there's some value to isolating those things. If you can isolate what is really well defined in this domain here and teach that in a way that's super, super clear, so that everyone then has that initial shared understanding, then move on to the areas that are less well defined, the fuzzier ones, and explore them in a way that is more appropriate for that. I think that's one method that we can use.
Yeah, and that brings up the issue of, one of the things that I've noticed. I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the sort of science of learning research and conversation is around like math and physics and like hard sciences versus something humanities or social studies, which is a bit more open-ended, and that takes, I think, a different approach, and we could get into all of that in a different podcast. Are there things that we have not talked about that you think are important to talk about in this conversation?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot, and I think I used to be very much like camp direct instruction, and I remember chatting to you like a year or so ago, and I think the classic polarized argument is never the right way to go about these kind of things. It's always about, what can I take from both approaches to make something that's even more effective. And that's something that I've more recently been trying to do within the idea of explanation. You'd have thought explanation is the ultimate form of direct instruction in some ways. You're literally just telling someone something, but actually no, you're recreating some kind of experience that allows them to see what you see. And that involves calling on all of these things from, really, really crystal clear example sequences and patterns, but also creating a sense of intrigue or inquiry as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, you we'll make sure to put the book in the show notes. Any other links? Are there any other places that you'd like them to visit or find you?
Yeah, I've recently started a Substack, so that would be it's called the Craft of Explanation. So yeah, covering some similar themes.
Okay. Do you remember the URL off the top of your head?
Oh yeah, it's explainyourself.substack.com.
Okay. So, like I said, we'll put that and a link to the book in the show notes. Are you still on social media? I don't know if I know we've.
Yeah.
You're on
I'm
LinkedIn.
on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram. It's there's my _James_Moore_1990.
Okay. We'll put the link to Instagram and LinkedIn in the show notes as well. But well, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Drew.
Yeah, it's always fascinating. I tell people that I certainly love it if people listen and share and all these kinds of things. But for me, it's always just an opportunity to engage in a conversation and learn. And appreciate doing that with you here.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.